Welcome to Heavy Strategy, the show where we ask good questions and hopefully you come up with the answers. We're not here to tell you what to do. We're just trying to help you think about how to get there.
Greg does not like when I do this, but he's Greg Ferro and I'm Johna Johnson, in case you just hopped on and wondering who these people are.
You can be internet friends with us on LinkedIn, or you can find Johna on her website at nemerdes.com. So what we wanted to do is do a bit of a retrospective for 2023. Very short show. We're not going to bang on about our predictions or anything, but I think there's some themes and some ideas that we could reasonably talk about as being things that are on our minds as we go in. I mean, obviously, as the year evolves, we'll talk about the things that are on our minds and as we go forward. But why don't you start off with what's on your mind, Johna? What's one of the big topics that you're working on?
Well, I'm going to take it in reverse and say, let's have a look at summarizing 2023 before we jump into 2024. And I would say it's absolutely clear that 2023 was the year of large language models and generative AI. No surprise there. I think it's the year that suddenly ordinary humans became aware of the potential of this particular flavor of AI. I think it's important, though, to not lose sight of some of the other things that were happening in 2023. And Greg and I had a show on this a little while back where we were talking about how technology sort of moves very quickly and then it kind of plateaus and consolidates. We saw a lot of consolidation of typical technology, traditional IT happening in 2023 and 22 and 20, modulo what was going on with COVID. But, the router space, you have Cisco going off and buying Splunk, you have HPE going off and buying Juniper. Basically, infrastructure has gotten very, very stabilized over the past several years to the point where some of the hard decisions and the hard problems have really gotten subsumed into the software. And while all of our attention was focused on the possibilities of AI, everything else was kind of leveling out and stabilizing and getting, frankly, a bit boring.
Yeah, and I think we saw that because AI became a real hype. Everything else was just, VMware is VMware, Nutanix was Nutanix, storage was storage. And we saw hyperconverged lose its momentum, public cloud slowing down because people are realizing the problems of and the shortcomings of the public cloud. It's very expensive in the public cloud. People are now saying we need to reevaluate. We're not making smart decisions. Also, post-COVID, everybody's tired. We've had all the economic issues, inflation, then not inflation. There was a shortage of people. Now companies are laying off.
The laying off, I think, is important to focus on because it seems to me very much that we're at another inflection point. And let me kind of talk about what I mean by another inflection point. Back in the 1950s and 1960s, IT didn't exist. Companies were buying these computers and they had kind of the computer wizard, the director of computing or something like that. And that guy, it was almost inevitably a guy, would kind of babysit the computers, make sure the computers got the right software, and make sure the users got what benefit they got, which was usually the back office productivity benefit. Accounting was revolutionized back in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
And then everything kind of stabilized and LANs came along. And all of a sudden, you had people who had job titles and backgrounds that were totally different from the computer operators, so to speak. But these people were hooking up these brand new networks and LANs and things like that. And
one of my very first technology jobs was getting WordPerfect 5.1 operating on a Novell NetWare LAN so that they could share files, the word processing files, and share printers. That was it. That was the whole thing.
Point of the LAN. And in fact, the value proposition of LANs for people that didn't want to spend the money, the original business case for LANs was printer sharing. As crazy as it sounds. Yep. In any event, people like Greg came out of the woodwork and they hadn't worked at IBM for, 50 years because that would have made you negative whatever years old when you started. But that was a whole different group of people that ultimately from the 70s through about the 90s, these people focused on networking. We moved into the concept of data centers. The internet started to appear. And by around the 90s, CIOs started to pop up. And these were individuals whose job for the next 10 years was really to rein in this technology sprawl, make it cost effective, turn into pretty much a bean counter and kind of subsume and tame it. So then we spent 20 years with CIOs doing that. And in the meantime, this digital transformation crept up around the edges, which really, if you think about it, I think of it as a long, slow explosion that starts at the core. Back office gets computerized, then the front office gets computerized. And with digital transformation, you're now using computers and communication technology for everyone else, for people who are not physically in an office, for customers, for suppliers. So it gets out beyond the bounds of the enterprise. And that was the big deal for the early couple decades of this century. And now we're sort of done with that. And you're hearing about, Greg, as you had mentioned, things like layoffs. People are saying we don't need traditional IT. And the same way that we didn't need as many traditional mainframe operators or as many LAN managers as each of these shifts happened, I think that's accurate. But what is also happening, and this is the important point, now we can pivot and look forward, is technology is becoming embedded so far across the organization that there's a new breed of technologists that's popping up.
Yeah.
And so you're seeing technology once again outside the traditional definition of IT, just like LANs were outside the traditional definition of mainframes.
Yeah, there's a few things that come into my mind because of the story about Novell NetWare and WordPerfect 5.1 and daisy wheel printers to improve the quality of bids for construction contracts. It's important to remember that back in those days, they used to buy that equipment on a 5-year lease, whereas now we buy technology equipment as a consumable. And I don't think most companies even capitalize it on the books for depreciation now. It's just a consumable.
They do, but it's a drag. It's a trailing indicator. In other words, big companies do it, but they probably shouldn't at this point.
In the old days,
companies
couldn't afford it. They'd had to go to the bank. That was so expensive that they went to a bank and got a loan to cover the cost of it. And then the price of PCs came down to the point where everybody could afford one and you could have lots of them, not just a few of them. But now what we're seeing is the price of IT is expanding rapidly. One of the things that we've seen over the last 5 years is the cost of IT has increased by my calculations, by 150%, which is far ahead of inflation or the value delivered. And we're starting to see companies say, hang on, we're now overspending on IT. There's definitely value in it, but there's a problem here. It's costing too much. And now that mirrors the wider economic situation where during COVID, companies started charging more and more. They talk about greedflation. And so there may be a price reset, but I suspect that in 2024, we're going to see a lot of vendors not hit their numbers because they've raised the prices to the point where customers are saying, I'm not seeing the value.
And here's my but no. I think it's really important to change your focal length of your vision from traditional IT and start looking at all the technologies that are happening outside of IT. So, for example, you kicked off this by asking if I was going to get yet another set of AV/AR glasses. And if you think about this, we're talking, we were swapping recommendations on mics and cameras. Those are not, and that's just a casual example, but those are not traditionally IT. They're something else. They're usually AV or some subset that are getting revolutionized. Yeah. And what you're also seeing is IoT is going gangbusters, partly because it was so primitive for so many years, and it's getting brought into the fold. And then you're seeing novel areas like, yes, AI, and yes, I know we disagree on this one, but quantum computing is starting to bubble up in supercomputers, and that will trickle down and eventually affect everyone. So you're starting to see things like quantum entanglement for networking. So you're starting to see a whole burst of technology outside the domain of traditional IT. Traditional IT vendors, absolutely, they're in for a rough slog. The good ones will survive, just like IBM is still here, but DEC isn't. So it's going to be a winnowing out of the traditional IT vendors. But at the same time, there's going to be a whole new generation of products that aren't even considered IT and will never be considered IT, that are still technology that drives value inside organizations.
Yeah. Come back to my point. My point is that AI is the only cool thing that's happening in infrastructure technology. You can take AI, add it to your infrastructure, and improve things. And we'll be doing shows on that in the weeks ahead. I know, no doubt we'll be talking about the movement from manual configuration to automation, where automation was configuring a single device, and then the migration to orchestration. Now, not all customers have reached, not every company has reached orchestration of their infrastructure yet, or their applications or automation. But the next phase after that is to add AI. So that AI can start to say, hang on, you're doing something here, but we could give you a process workflow that does this for you so you don't have to do it manually. Or we can look in the telemetry that's coming out of the system or the logs and suddenly say, there's a problem here, you should go and do something about it. So we're moving from this reactive, something's reported as a problem, to a more proactive, we're seeing something, we're flagging it to you. And that is an efficiency. That is not going to take away your job, but it's going to let you do more. But at the same time, you've got to remember that for many companies, their infrastructure is now so complicated that it's very difficult to manage it. In the old days, when you were a networking engineer working for one company, you used to work on one brand of router, one brand of firewall. It was comprehensible for a single person to get around most of what was going on. You might have a specialization in firewalls or proxies or the MPLS NetWAN or the branch network or the campus, but generally everybody could be across anything. But in the modern era, it's much more complicated. SD-WANs, overlays, campus security, zero trust, all that stuff is much more complicated, and you need a way to address that. And I think that's where the demand for AI is coming from.
Well, I think that's true, but I think focusing on AI is a little bit short-sighted. I think you're correct that practically speaking, that is the most interesting, innovative thing that's happened in the past, several years. However, I think it's just an indication of the broader theme of software-defined and cloud-based infrastructure. And I think more broadly, what's happening with infrastructure is with AI, yes, and automation, yes, but also cloud-to-cloud integration is something that, for example, I sit down with clients and they say, well, I don't need any more network engineers, but I'm up to my eyeballs trying to figure out how to integrate my 57 different SaaS solutions in a way that I can implement and orchestrate workflows in them that are meaningful. And there are tools for that. They're cloud-based tools, but that whole level of infrastructure at that level is something that's very, very different than it was before, because now we're talking about integrating applications in a way that never happened before.
Yeah. So what you're saying there is that you're seeing a convergence between off-prem and on-prem.
Exactly. So, and everything both off and on is moving up into software defined, often, but not exclusively cloud-based. And those two things are major shifts.
So one of the things I think we'll see in 2024 is a very big trend to on-prem. So people will start to say, I can see these bundles like HP's GreenLake, Dell Apex, where they provide the whole stack and you don't have to do any of the integration. You buy it sort of like an old mini computer from the 1990s. When I first started out, I was working on mini computers, and you bought the computer and everything, you got everything with it. The storage and everything was in one stack. And we're now getting to this rack scale. I think we're going to see more and more of that on-prem, because customers don't want to have to do the integration. They don't want to buy.
Well, but I disagree on that, because you're missing the SaaS universe. That horse has left the barn. Everything is SaaS at this point, and SaaS to SaaS integration is something with those workflows that I'm talking about, where above the level of infrastructure, there's still an enormous amount of effectively application infrastructure that needs to get done integrating these clouds together.
Yeah,
so I
agree with you. I think that's right. But what I'm also seeing is signs of fatigue around SaaS. Companies are starting to realize the hidden costs and how they cumulatively get out of control.
I have not seen any indication of that in SaaS. In fact, exactly the contrary. When I sit down and talk to a client, I've had cases where I sit down and talk to a client and they say, oh, we're not doing any cloud at all. And I go, you mean you're just telling me you have a data center? Now let's talk about how you do your payroll and your accounting and your CRM, and they're all cloud-based, and they never even thought about it. And they didn't even realize that the biggest problem they're running into is that these things aren't glued together effectively and don't have reliable and resilient workflows between them. And I have not heard a single person say, oh, Salesforce, I think I'm going to bring that all in-house, because logistically it makes no sense.
No,
the flexibility that these cloud-based apps are giving people, you can think that, but there's no evidence for it.
Behind closed doors, I think you're seeing, and from what I'm seeing, is customers are starting to look at how much they're spending on SaaS and starting to question long-term whether this is sustainable. Because the pricing's out of control. They can't control the price that Salesforce.
I really disagree. I don't see people complaining. It's no different than, Microsoft increasing the rates for its licensing for desktop stuff year after year. The real issue is not cloud versus on-prem. It's flexible and expandable versus not. And, oh, by the way, are we getting locked into a single vendor? That's it. The problems aren't new. It has nothing to do with cloud. It has everything to do with the fact that Microsoft dominates a certain class of software, and Salesforce dominates a certain other class of software, and ServiceNow dominates a certain other class of software. And these guys, once they become your sole provider, can jack up the prices as much as they want, regardless of the delivery mode. So I don't see any signs of pushing back against SaaS.
I am. No. SaaS companies are reporting falling revenues because customers are taking stock and reducing. And
but I haven't seen a single customer deploy an on-prem solution where they used to be deploying a SaaS.
No, that's not we're not at that stage yet. I'm saying So I'm pointing out that I'm starting to see pushback against SaaS because the costs are uncontrolled.
No, it's pushback. You're focusing on the wrong thing. It's pushback against particular vendors because they're jacking their prices up, but they're switching to a different SaaS vendor.
No, what they're actually doing is discontinuing services with the SaaS. So they're cutting costs. So companies like Snowflake and Splunk,
but they're moving to different.
Splunk, for example, we are definitely seeing rehousing. So customers who've been using Splunk are definitely pulling out of Splunk and rehousing that on-prem.
Splunk is a special case, though, because number one, it's SaaS, but it's not user SaaS; it's infrastructure SaaS. And number two, I think there's been knowledge across the board for a long time that Splunk has been brilliant at grabbing revenue and being sole provider. And now that it's part of Cisco, as we talked about on a previous show. The fact that both Splunk and Cisco are tremendous at extracting margins from their customers is causing everybody to say, hang on, I need to rethink both Splunk and Cisco because this is crazy. We have two vendors who are sole source. You'd never get fired for buying Splunk or Cisco. And now they're just going to come at me and they've gotten even stronger together.
So
now I'm going to rethink
my point
everything.
is that in the circles that I move in, I am definitely seeing people rehouse parts
Splunk.
of. Once you've got something like Splunk, you put stuff in there, and then suddenly you realize it didn't need to be there.
You can't get it out.
You can't stop using Splunk. What I'm also agreeing with you is you're not going to stop using Snowflake, a data warehouse, or you're not going to use a log management or a performance. But what you can do is start to pick bits of it out and rehouse it, right? Or the next project that you do doesn't go to a SaaS; it gets done on-prem, and that's increasingly what I'm seeing.
I'd say for the special use case of infrastructure, possibly. But the broader use case of SaaS overall, SaaS applications, those are just continuing to grow. And they're still highly, highly competitive because even though Microsoft can kind of dominate with Teams and Microsoft 365, there's still plenty of counters to that. So I think if you take the step back, where the growth is coming from, I think what we can agree on is where the growth is coming from is not traditional infrastructure IT. Yes. We're seeing retrenching, cost savings, optimization, performance improvements, all those things that you see in a period of relative slack in terms of tides, but you're seeing enormous growth outside of what you would call traditional IT, and that's just taking off.
And I believe we're seeing the cloud companies slow their growth. So with
the infrastructure cloud companies.
Yes, they're slowing from 45% growth to 25% growth,
and they'll flatten out at a nice 5 to 10%. 3 years down.
You can't sustain investing $100 billion a year into that infrastructure. Each company, we're already starting to see the signs where Azure and AWS are struggling to keep themselves going. They're not able to hold staff. Profitability is falling. I saw something recently that AWS people are saying that they used to have 2 pizza teams. Well, that worked when you were just doing hypervisors or, whatever. But if you're building an AI, you need 400 or 500 people in that system. You can't do it in chunks of 12, right? Or chunks of 10.
Exactly. And your example is perfect because one of the things we did was a research study earlier in 2023. And one of the findings was that the growth rate of AI specialists outside of IT was at least double the growth rate of AI specialists within IT, which makes perfect sense because the application of AI really, essentially what you're trying to do is turbocharge subject matter experts with all the tools they need to deploy their subject matter expertise much more broadly. So, for example, on financial firms, financial advisors are AI enhanced. They have the ability to do things, but they're still humans. They just need the assistance of an AI infrastructure around them. And that's going to get built inside the advisor and the customer support organizations, not within the IT organization. And that's kind of the message I would give anybody listening this is you're going to hear a lot of gloom and doom about how network engineers are getting laid off and storage engineers are getting laid off. And it's just going to be a handful of key people if you're, rehoming things on-prem. That's all true, but all the job opportunities are happening outside of what used to be called IT because IT is in a retrenchment phase, but technology is in a growth phase.
Okay. Well, I think since you talked about retrenchment, do you think the role of being an employee or a salary slave changes in 2024?
I don't. There's been the fads of being a free agent and a consultant, and I think there's always going to be room for consultants to come and ply their trades. But quite frankly, especially in the United States, unless and until we figure out a way to get healthcare separate from being an employee, there's always going to be a huge tilt in the scale to being an employee.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm saying, even if you're one of the people that's inside a large enterprise organization, the chances are very high that you and your team can have great jobs and great careers doing technology in that organization, but it's 50-50 whether it'll be within IT or not. I'd say right now, I don't really want to be a CIO. That would be my main piece.
The only advice I have is make sure you've got enough money saved up so that if something happens to you, you don't fall apart.
Well, that's always good advice. Yes.
Yeah. So, but even more so, I think in 2024, you're going to see a lot more layoffs. Companies are going to use AI and then lay off people, learn the hard way.
Citibank just announced that it was laying off, retrenching, rebuilding, and laying off 20,000 people. But I would point out that a lot of the people that are getting laid off are not necessarily in IT. And in fact, they are probably simultaneously hiring another 5,000 to 10,000 people to assist, but they have different skills.
Yes. The secret here is not that, A, don't get attached to your employer, and B, have 3 to 6 months money so that if you get laid off, even in a way where the employer doesn't pay you out, you can survive and you don't have to panic and your life is all okay. Let's move to one more topic, geopolitics and supply chain. We've seen so much happen with China, with Ukraine, with Russia, all the disruption as vendors have been moving their supply chains gradually away from China. Does that continue in 2024? And does that something that people should be factoring in?
Yes and yes. How's that? From a U.S. perspective, I have to say one of the happy notes for 2024 is the fact that the CHIPS initiative in the U.S. is going gangbusters. And I'm about to lose a bet, actually, with a friend who swore up and down that the first fabs would be opening by 2025. And I said, you're nuts. It takes way too long to do those. And long story short, Mark, I owe you a box of your favorite chocolate because I think there's been a fire lit under the manufacturers, and I think you're seeing an enormous resurgence of basic technology happening in the U.S. with the entire supply chain moving inside the U.S. So, and part of that is in response to what happened with COVID.
Well, not just the U.S., but also Europe and also throughout Asia. So Japan, the Philippines, Vietnam, Australia is picking up some of it. EU, so particularly in
I'll
Europe,
trust your judgment
Germany.
on that because I don't pay close enough attention to that. To be honest, Greg, just a side note, I recently drove up the length of California and went, holy cow, this thing is one of the biggest countries in the world. And I haven't been able to stop thinking about California as a separate country since then. And I was born in California. You'd think I'd know this. So I think
it's going to happen. We're going to see much more. It's just an evolving situation. Right as we speak, we're seeing an escalation right throughout the Arabic. So now you've got Pakistan and Afghanistan. And
my God, yes, we could have a World War III in the Middle East in a week, and it's not in the news, which frightens me.
And it actually affects everything because that's where the shipping goes.
That's where the ships are.
China to the US, China to Europe.
If you're sending cruise missiles against shipping vessels, that's going to be a supply chain break. But
they're ballistic missiles, not cruise missiles. But I'm not going to argue the point. That's getting into semantics at this point.
Before we wrap up, Greg, I do want to highlight something because I know there's this tendency to sort of keep going into, I don't want to call it negativity, but war, supply chain disruption, IT consolidation. And I just want to highlight that I have not in 30 years seen the amount of technology investment and growth and innovation, but it just happens to be outside the four walls of traditional IT. If you look at things like the first dual neural implant was done earlier in 2023, which now not only enabled a paralyzed person to move his hands, but also to feel because the feedback loop was built in. That kind of stuff is what I'm talking about when I say outside of traditional IT. So if you're a technologist, the future's never been brighter. You just need to raise your head up and look outside of the IT cubicle and say, where is technology doing something that I'm super interested in?
I'm also very excited about taking a positive out of a negative. The rise of drones in military conflict has seen billions of dollars flow into production, manufacturing, assembly. But I think we're going to see just a massive expansion of that technology in terms of software. So if you put AI on top of drones, the potential there for deliveries, for scanning, for
or just
building
entertainment.
inspection.
I mean, with the Grateful Dead show, I think it was last summer, they actually had a drone fleet doing the entertainment. And I looked at that and I said, number one, that is so much better than fireworks. And number two,
yes,
you don't just have to work in the military if you want to have your career in drones. There's so much commercialization here that we've just begun to scratch the surface.
That was the one that I was thinking of lately. All this stuff that's happening now, obviously it's terrifying that you can weaponize a drone, but that'll spill over into civilian use cases, which have got me very interested. And I also think that life in IT is probably going to get better as we get more automation, more monitoring, more visibility, more telemetry, I think we're going to be able to do better jobs. We could finally start to be able to say to business, I know what's going on in my infrastructure. Does that make sense? Am I being too hopeful?
And the reason I'm smiling at you is, as you were saying that, I remember the very first time I used a high-level programming language after having programmed an assembly and going, wait, to multiply two numbers together, I just enter 3 times 2. I don't have to move all these registers and sum everything repeatedly. Oh my God, this is brilliant.
I mean, just having something to give me root cause analysis.
Yes.
So I can come, something goes
wrong.
Why
did this happen? Yes.
Yeah. Give me a starting point, root cause analysis. Give me some troubleshooting tools that I can run a script that goes off and does a thing. And I can suddenly say, oh, hang on. I know exactly what's going wrong because I got all the data in front of me. And
I think a corollary to your observation, Greg, is that it's going to be much easier for IT folks to tie what they're doing to business value, because you're able to say this happened, and then you can look at quickly the ripple down effect and say, here's where we lost a lot of money, or here's where we were able to generate a new revenue stream. And that's another thing that's going to make life easier within IT.
I spent a lot of my career doing visibility and telemetry, with whatever I could do. And honestly, I think a lot of what I did successfully was due to the fact that I could take time to do better troubleshooting because I had better visibility. They were monitoring tools or visibility tools at best, but yeah. Well, unfortunately, that's all we've got time for today. We have to run because time is up. Johna, where can people find you on the internet?
Come hit me up at nemurtis.com. That's where I hang out and would love to see you there.
If you want to get involved in the conversation, head on over to the Packet Pushers Slack channel. That's where you can participate in the conversation. If you want to ask us questions, I'm hanging around in there. You can ask me questions, and maybe Johna, if we get enough of you, you are there. If you ask questions, we'll jump in. I think there's even a heavy strategy channel.
There is, as of yesterday, there's a heavy strategy channel.
So come on in. If you want to ask us questions about links or conversation or expand the ideas, we'd be welcome you there. And if you've got any feedback, don't hesitate to head on over to packetpushers.net/FU and send us your follow-up, and we'll be able to respond directly back to you. If there's something you want us to discuss, something to talk about, and this is your invitation to join us on the show. If you ever want to come on and argue with us, debate, share some ideas, ask the questions, come on. Let's have a chat and see if you're up for the game. As always, thanks for listening, and we'll see you again in a couple of weeks.